The winter of 1944 was closing in on Berlin, but inside the Vorbunk, the air was thick with tension, fear, and a stubborn hope that defied reason. Hitler, once the unshakable architect of Europe's devastation, now appeared diminished, hunched over maps and reports, his voice tight with urgency. Outside, the Soviet juggernaut pressed relentlessly from the east, while the Western Allies tightened their grip from France. The Reich, which had once seemed invincible, now teetered on the edge of annihilation. Yet, Hitler refused to accept the magnitude of the disaster. He called for a meeting, one that would forever reveal the fracture between fantasy and reality in the final days of Nazi Germany. Inside the dimly lit war room, the generals arrived in silence. Each man carried the weight of recent failures, the heavy knowledge of cities lost, of U-boats sunk, of divisions annihilated in the frozen Russian steppes. Field Marshal von Kluge, General Obest, Model, and Admiral Dönitz, among others, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. The Führer was still dreaming impossible victories. The tables were cluttered with maps, pins marking the relentless advance of Soviet and Allied forces. Yet Hitler's eyes darted to one corner with the intensity of a man grasping for miracles. He demanded to know how they would reverse the tide, how they would rescue the Reich from collapse. And above all, he demanded solutions that were no longer possible. The generals, bound by duty and terror, tried to speak the truth. The situation was catastrophic. Supply lines had been severed, reinforcements were scattered, morale was at an all-time low, and winter made any large-scale counteroffensive an almost suicidal endeavor. Yet Hitler would not hear it. His mind clung to the vague hope that a sudden technological breakthrough, a secret weapon, a miracle counter, might yet deliver victory. He questioned his commanders with increasing desperation, pointing to Berlin on the map, his finger trembling. "Can we hold it? Can we strike back?" he demanded. His words, sharp and commanding, masked the panic beneath. As the meeting dragged on, the generals offered what they could: tactical suggestions, limited counterattacks, and defensive strategies that, in a sane world, might have bought weeks, perhaps months, of reprieve. But Hitler's fixation on miracles revealed the psychological trap in which he had ensnared himself. Victory, he believed, was still attainable, if only the right strike could be made. The room was heavy with the tension of suppressed dissent. Men who had once charged into battle on his orders now faced the impossible task of managing his delusions while confronting an undeniable reality. The conversation took on a darker tone when Hitler's desperation turned to pleading. His voice, usually confident and commanding, now cracked as he implored his generals to find a path to triumph. The room was silent, save for the low murmur of maps being adjusted and the occasional cough. Each commander knew the futility of the task, yet none dared openly challenge This was a moment that revealed not only Hitler's diminishing grasp on reality, but also the fatal rigidity of his leadership. The Reich's fate had shifted irrevocably. Yet in this room, clinging to denial and hope, the illusion of control persisted. By the end of the meeting, Hitler emerged more convinced than ever that a miracle might save Germany. The generals departed quietly, their minds weighed down by the impossible burden of planning under delusion. Outside, the world continued its relentless march, Soviet tanks rolling ever closer, Allied bombers tearing at the cities, and the Reich itself crumbling under the weight of its hubris. Inside the bunker, however, Hitler's obsession with impossible victories remained unshaken, a chilling testament to the power of denial in the face of catastrophic defeat. The morning after the desperate meeting in the Führer bunker, the generals gathered once more in their austere quarters. Far removed from the fevered mind of Hitler but still trapped within the oppressive shadow of his authority, the tension of the previous night lingered like smoke over Berlin, a silent reminder of the chasm between fantasy and reality. Each man was painfully aware of the war's trajectory. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Western Allies were advancing relentlessly, and the German war machine, once a marvel of precision and terror, was now a fragmented and faltering shadow of its former self. Yet, despite the grim reality, the men knew they had a duty to devise a plan, however limited, to buy time and preserve what remained of the Reich. Field Marshal Model, known as the Führer's fireman for his reputation as a crisis commander, opened the discussion with a detailed assessment of troop dispositions on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces, he reported, were executing a level of coordination and intensity never seen before in the Wehrmacht's campaigns. The Red Army had adapted and innovated at a pace that Germany could no longer match. The myth of the unstoppable German advance, Motto remarked quietly, has crumbled. The wolf-packs of U-boats, the panzer thrusts, the Luftwaffe's dominance, all of it is no longer sufficient. We are facing a juggernaut. His words were stark, unflinching, and met with a heavy silence from the room. Admiral de Nitz, seated across from Model, adjusted his uniform and leaned over a naval map. The Atlantic, once the stage for German triumphs, had become a graveyard of U-boats and missed opportunities. Convoys were no longer vulnerable. An Allied code-breaking had stripped the Kriegsmarine of any advantage it might have retained. The Wolf-Pack strategy, he admitted grimly, is exhausted. We are exposed, outmaneuvered, and outgunned. The ocean that once belonged to us now belongs to them. His words, though softly spoken, resonated with a chilling finality. The generals moved through tactical assessments, from defensive positions in the Ardennes to counter-offensives in Hungary, always returning to the same conclusion. Germany's military options were shrinking by the day. Each potential maneuver carried unbearable risk. Each plan hinged on variables that no longer favored the Reich. Yet they were bound by loyalty and fear, unable to present these realities directly to Hitler. The tension of suppressed truths filled the room, a quiet but palpable pressure that threatened to break even the most disciplined officers. As the hours passed, the discussion shifted to what measures could be implemented to delay the inevitable. Strategic withdrawals, reinforcement of key cities, and improvised defensive lines. But even these strategies were limited, temporary solutions at best, and they offered no hope of ultimate victory. The generals understood that what Hitler demanded, a miraculous turnaround, was now outside the realm of possibility. They were navigating a world where the Reich's previous advantages had evaporated, replaced by overwhelming Soviet manpower, relentless Allied pressure, and a war-weary population unable to sustain total mobilization. By late afternoon, the meeting concluded, and the men departed with heavy hearts and minds burdened by the impossibility of their task. Outside the bunker, Berlin carried on under the ominous rumble of distant artillery and the distant drone of reconnaissance aircraft. Inside, Hitler's delusions continued unchecked, a stark contrast to the sober realities his commanders now faced. This was the beginning of the Reich's final chapter, a period defined not by strategy or conquest, but by desperation, denial, and the slow, inexorable collapse of a once mighty empire. The generals, having confronted the harsh truths, now bore the grim responsibility of executing orders they knew were futile, a tragic dance between duty and the stark reality of defeat. History would remember these men not only for their military expertise but also for the impossible task of trying to navigate a Reich collapsing under its own hubris. The illusion of control was gone. Only the shadow of a fading empire remained. By the time dawn broke over the battered plains of the Eastern Front, the full scale of Germany's predicament had become undeniable. Reports arrived in Berlin like grim messengers, each one more devastating than the last. The Wehrmacht, once a symbol of precision and fear, now staggered under the relentless pressure of the Soviet juggernaut. Entire divisions had been encircled, panzer units shattered, and supply lines ripped apart by the Red Army's relentless offensives. For Hitler, the nightmare he had long refused to acknowledge was now materializing in brutal clarity. Generals gathered once more in the subterranean halls vibrating with tension and the faint echo of distant artillery. Hitler, his face pale but stiff with indignation, demanded updates, as though his commanding presence could bend reality to his will. Field Marshal Manstein, with a grim expression etched deeply into his face, spoke first. "My Führer, the situation is deteriorating faster than we anticipated. The Soviets have broken through multiple sectors, and our ability to mount effective counterattacks is severely compromised." The words fell like stones into the room, heavy and unyielding. Hitler's eyes flickered with disbelief, a storm of frustration and anger clouding his judgment. He waved dismissively at the reports, insisting that with the right strategy, The tide could still turn. Yet every map, every intelligence brief, told the same story. The Eastern Front was no longer a series of battles Germany could dictate. Soviet forces, bolstered by immense manpower, superior logistics, and unyielding resolve, were reshaping the front lines hour by hour. Each step forward by the Red Army was a step closer to Berlin, and Hitler's illusions of victory were crumbling like brittle ice underfoot. General Zhukov, though thousands of miles away, loomed in the minds of the German commanders. His strategic genius had turned the tide at Stalingrad, and now threatened to envelop entire German armies in coordinated offensives. The Wehrmacht's previous advantages, mobility, training, and tactical innovation, were now countered at every turn. Supply shortages, exhaustion, and dwindling morale compounded the crisis, leaving the generals with grim choices: withdraw and concede territory, or risk annihilation in hopeless engagements. As Hitler argued over potential counterattacks, Field Marshal Kesselring intervened, his voice calm but cutting. "Mein Führer, the enemy's strength is such that conventional tactics will no longer suffice. We cannot turn back time. Our armies are stretched thin, and the Eastern Front is collapsing from within. Any further insistence on miracles risks total destruction." Yet even this rational caution met only stubborn denial. Hitler's obsession with impossible victories had begun to blind him entirely to the operational reality. The generals left the meeting aware that their every action would now be dictated by desperation rather than strategy. The Eastern Front had become a theater not of opportunity but of survival. Cities once considered impregnable were being evacuated, and troops were forced into improvised defensive lines that could not withstand the Soviet tide. In the quiet moments between briefings, the officers reflected on the grim irony. Their meticulous planning, their countless victories, all threatened to unravel under the relentless advance of an enemy they had once underestimated. Outside Berlin, life carried on under the shadow of impending disaster. Civilians heard distant artillery and air raids, but could not grasp the magnitude of the collapse unfolding hundreds of kilometers away. Inside the bunker, Hitler clung to the belief that victory was still possible, even as every report, every map, and every officer's council screamed otherwise. The Eastern Front was no longer just a battlefield. It had become the mirror of Germany's dying ambitions, reflecting the fatal consequences of hubris, denial, and the unstoppable momentum of history itself. By the time the sun dipped behind the grim horizon of Eastern Europe, the atmosphere inside the Führer bunker had grown almost unbearable. The air was thick with tension, mingling with cigarette smoke and the faint metallic scent of unease. Hitler, seated rigidly at the head of the long table, tapped his fingers impatiently, eyes darting over maps marked with the stark reality of retreating lines and encircled divisions. Every general in the room knew the futility of their presence, yet none dared openly challenge the Führer. Increasingly erratic commands. The day's reports painted a sobering picture. Soviet armored divisions had breached multiple defensive positions, advancing like an unstoppable flood. Hetman troops, weary from months of continuous fighting and dwindling supplies, were being forced into desperate rearguard actions. The Wehrmacht's famed blitzkrieg momentum had been replaced by a grinding, chaotic struggle for survival. Communication lines were breaking down, coordination was failing, and panic was creeping into even the most disciplined units. Hitler slammed his fist onto the table, the sound reverberating through the bunker like a gunshot. "We will not surrender. We will not retreat. I demand immediate counteroffensives along the southern sectors. We must strike back before it's too late." His voice carried the conviction of a man refusing to accept reality. But the generals exchanged grim, silent glances. They knew any attempt to comply with these orders would result not in victory, but in wholesale slaughter. Field Marshal Manstein, long admired for his strategic genius, leaned forward cautiously. "Mein Führer, our reserves are insufficient. The men are exhausted. Supplies are nearly depleted, and the enemy's numbers overwhelm us. Any offensive action at this point risks annihilation." Yet Hitler's gaze was fixed, unyielding, a man clinging to a vision of triumph that reality refused to accommodate. He gestured sharply, dismissing the warning. "Excuses. I will not tolerate defeat. If our generals cannot deliver victory, I will find those who can. The generals quietly mapped out alternative strategies, knowing full well that any suggestions would be met with skepticism. They devised plans for tactical withdrawals, reorganizations, and consolidation of forces. But each proposal was tempered by the harsh truth. Germany's options were rapidly diminishing. Every delay, every failed counterattack, every lost city further cemented the inevitability of collapse. The Eastern Front had transformed from a battlefield of calculated engagements into a theater of desperation and improvisation. As the hours passed, Hitler's orders became increasingly fantastical. He demanded simultaneous offensives across multiple sectors, reinforced by units that no longer existed or were already cut off. Maps were marked in red, arrows pointing to impossible targets, a visual testament to the widening chasm between ambition and reality. The generals executed the commands with grim efficiency, knowing that following them meant sacrificing countless lives for fleeting hope. Outside the bunker, the reality of war continued its relentless march. CTS Bodennet supply lines crumbled, and the Red Army pressed forward with unwavering determination. The German army, once the embodiment of precision and power, now staggered under the weight of an unstoppable force. Hitler's insistence on miracles only deepened the tragedy, turning disciplined strategy into chaotic desperation. By nightfall, the bunker's atmosphere was thick with the silence of dread. Each officer knew that Germany's fate on the Eastern Front was slipping through their fingers. Hitler, however, remained adamant, issuing orders as if sheer will could bend the tide of history. The desperate commands of a desperate leader now stood against the relentless reality of an advancing enemy, marking a turning point that would seal the future of the Third Reich. The Eastern Front was no longer a line to hold. It was a mirror reflecting the dying dreams of a man who refused to accept the inevitable. The bunker's dim lights cast long, sinister shadows across the room, each flicker highlighting the strained faces of generals who had once commanded respect and fear across Europe. By now, the Wehrmacht's Eastern Front was a fractured web of isolated units, cut off from one another by advancing Soviet forces. Radio communications were erratic, reports delayed or outright impossible, and every transmission carried the unmistakable stench of defeat. In this subterranean chamber, Hitler's obsession with control collided violently with the unraveling reality outside, creating a maelstrom of confusion and fear. Hitler leaned over the maps spread across the table, his finger tracing imaginary lines, 2 points that no longer existed. His orders demanded coordination between divisions that were days, if not weeks, apart. He spoke of encirclements, counterattacks, and decisive strikes, as if the German army remained the unstoppable force it had once been. The generals nodded dutifully, scribbling down his commands, their hands trembling slightly. They had become actors in a tragic play, forced to follow the delusions of a man who could not accept failure. General Heinz Guderian, known for his mechanized warfare expertise, spoke quietly, but with urgency. Mainfor, without communication and with units scattered, these orders are impossible to execute. Attempting them will only lead to needless casualties. Hitler's eyes blazed, and he interrupted sharply. Impossible. There is no such thing. Germany does not know the word impossible. The room fell silent, each officer understanding the futility of resistance. Compliance had become the only way to survive, even if survival now meant guiding men into slaughter. Outside the bunker, the Red Army pressed relentlessly. Soviet tanks rolled across the shattered plains. Artillery fire reduced villages to rubble, and infantry advanced with grim determination. Every hour brought news of lost positions, collapsed supply lines, and entire divisions trapped in insurgency. The once pristine Wehrmacht units were now ragged formations, scavenging what they could to hold back a tide they could not stop. Hitler's insistence on unrealistic coordination turned strategy into theater, tactics into tragedy. Within the bunker, a sense of quiet desperation began to take hold. The generals whispered among themselves, devising contingency plans that were carefully concealed from the Führer's piercing gaze. They attempted to salvage what remained, to create pockets of organized resistance, but the dissonance between Hitler's commands and the battlefield's reality made every effort futile. Orders were delayed, misunderstood, and often executed too late. What remained of Germany's military discipline was now measured by how many could follow irrational directives without collapsing entirely. Hitler, sensing his grip on reality slipping, began issuing increasingly fragmented directives. He demanded reinforcements in regions already overrun, counterattacks at points where no soldiers remained, and precise timings that the chaos outside made impossible. The generals complied with grim resignation, each order a silent testament to their fading autonomy and the unstoppable advance of the Soviets. The Eastern Front had transformed from a theater of calculated strategy into a nightmarish chessboard, with Hitler moving pieces that no longer existed. As night deepened, the bunker echoed with the hum of radios, the scratching of pens on paper, and the subdued murmurs of men trapped between duty and despair. Each order carried with it a deadly inevitability. Soldiers on the front lines would follow them, and countless lives would be lost for the illusion of control. The German High Command, once the embodiment of military precision, had become the instrument of chaos, executing the impossible in the face of unrelenting reality. By the early hours, it was clear that the once feared Wehrmacht had lost its cohesion. Hitler's desperate insistence on miracles only magnified the collapse of coordination, transforming an already desperate struggle into systemic breakdown. The Eastern Front, vast and unforgiving, had become a theater where orders were no longer guidance, but a cruel reflection of a leader's denial. Germany's fate was no longer determined by strategy, but by the relentless march of history, indifferent to the desperate commands echoing in the Führer bunker below. The bunker seemed to pulse with an almost tangible tension. Hitler's pale face, illuminated by the dim glow of the map lamps, was etched with obsession. His eyes darted over the scattered pins and annotations that represented the remnants of an empire on the brink of collapse. Every report from the front lines brought fresh horror, but to Hitler, it was merely a challenge, an invitation to prove his genius. The generals surrounding him had grown accustomed to the impossible. Orders that defied logic, plans that ignored reality, and demands for miracles where none could exist. Hitler's voice cut through the stale air, commanding, pleading, and threatening all at once. If we lose the East, we lose everything. Every division must strike at the same moment. Every city must be held. Every river line defended. His finger stabbed the map with manic insistence, as if the act alone could conjure obedience from shattered troops thousands of miles away. The generals exchanged grim glances. Some whispered quiet doubts. Others simply nodded, resigned to the futility. General Wilhelm Keitel, normally composed and authoritative, spoke with cautious reason. Mein Führer, the divisions are exhausted, the supplies are depleted, and communications are unreliable. Coordinating a simultaneous strike across these lines is impossible. Hitler's head snapped toward him, eyes blazing with fury. Impossible! You dare speak that word! Germany expects victory, and I demand it. The generals had learned long ago that disagreement invited wrath, yet silence offered no salvation. Every word carried weight in a room suffused with fear. Outside the bunker, the Eastern Front was a tapestry of destruction. Cities smoldered under relentless artillery fire, and highways that once supported rapid armored maneuvers were clogged with retreating columns, abandoned tanks, and the dead. Soviet forces advanced with grim precision, exploiting every weakness and gap in the German lines. For the men in the field, Hitler's commands were abstract instructions that could not be executed. They moved like phantoms, trying to follow directives that assumed an order that no longer existed. Inside, Hitler outlined his last gambit. He envisioned a series of concentrated counterattacks that would, in his mind, reverse the momentum of the Soviets. Each plan was more audacious than the last, demanding rapid coordination, flawless timing, and sheer bravery from men already exhausted and demoralized. The generals scribbled notes, translating his visions into orders they knew could never succeed. It was a ritual of obedience, a mechanical execution of commands divorced from reality. The tension in the room thickened. Some officers considered quietly resigning their posts, while others contemplated subtle ways to mitigate the disaster their leader was creating. But Hitler's presence was oppressive, a shadow that demanded compliance. Each map marked with impossibilities represented thousands of lives that would be wasted. Yet the Führer's delusions remained untouchable. The Eastern Front, once a theater of strategic prowess, had become a landscape of desperation dictated by fantasy. As night deepened, Hitler's speeches grew more frenetic. He spoke of glory, vengeance, and the eventual triumph of the Reich. yet his words rang hollow even to his own ears. The generals followed silently, aware that their loyalty had become a vehicle for catastrophe. Every order sent down the chain would encounter the brutal reality of Soviet counteroffensives, and every attempt to enforce coordination would fail. The Führer's last gambit was not a plan, but a desperate assertion of authority against the inevitable. By dawn, the room was silent, except for the faint scratching of pens on paper and the soft murmur of dispatches being prepared. Hitler stared at the maps, a man trapped between vision and delusion, while his generals executed what they could with dwindling resources. History was moving inexorably, indifferent to the desperate maneuvers of men below and above the lines. The Eastern Front was no longer Germany's to command. It had become a crucible where obedience, desperation, and the futility of human will collided. In the end, Hitler's last gambit was less a strategy than a mirror of his unraveling mind. A series of impossible instructions that magnified chaos, drained courage, and sealed the fate of an army already overwhelmed. The generals understood the truth. No miracle could save what was already lost. The bunker's oppressive atmosphere had grown heavier with each passing day. Hitler's relentless demands, his fevered speeches, and his grandiose plans had pushed the generals to the edge of what had begun as unquestioning loyalty had curdled into fear, doubt, and a quiet, simmering rebellion. Outside, the Eastern Front was unraveling under the weight of reality, but inside, a more subtle battle was taking place, a struggle between blind obedience and measured defiance. General Heinz Guderian, the celebrated master of armored warfare, moved with a calculated caution. His mind was a battlefield of strategy and conscience. Every order from the Führer, every new miracle plan, threatened to throw thousands of soldiers into futile slaughter. Guderian knew the consequences of outright disobedience: arrest, humiliation, or execution. Yet he also understood that slavish compliance would ensure the destruction of the very forces he had spent decades shaping. With quiet deliberation, he began to adjust deployment plans, rerouting divisions and delaying attacks, always under the guise of operational necessity. The other generals watched each other carefully. Some whispered in private corridors, sharing insights and tactical adjustments, forming a network of silent resistance. They were not traitors, they were guardians, attempting to preserve what little life remained from the Führer's irrational orders. Lieutenant General Walter Model, known for his defensive acumen, took the initiative to strengthen weak points along the front, often contradicting directives to advance or counterattack in impossible conditions. His actions were calculated, subtle, and utterly necessary. Hitler, in his frenzy, failed to notice these small acts of defiance. He relied on reports, briefings, and the illusion of control, assuming that every instruction was being executed with meticulous precision. In reality, the generals had learned to navigate the line between compliance and pragmatism. Every misdirected division, every delayed counterattack was a lifeline for men in the field, buying precious hours and reducing casualties. The quiet revolt was a testament to human judgment overriding blind obedience, a silent stand against the unraveling logic of a deluded leader. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front continued to exact its brutal toll. Soviet forces pressed forward relentlessly, exploiting gaps and weaknesses that the generals had anticipated and mitigated. CTS Burnett roads were clogged with retreating units, and communications were in chaos. Yet, where the generals' subtle interventions had taken root, pockets of resistance remained surprisingly resilient. Entire battalions were saved from annihilation. Small towns held longer than expected, and strategic retreats were executed with precision that belied Hitler's unrealistic expectations. The tension in the bunker was palpable. Each general had to weigh the cost of intervention against the risk of detection. Every telegram sent upward was carefully phrased, every report crafted to maintain the illusion of compliance while subtly subverting catastrophic directives. It was a psychological chess game, one that required nerve, calculation, and courage. They were trapped between the demands of a dictator and the moral imperative to save lives. Each decision a delicate balance of obedience and rebellion. As night fell, the generals gathered around maps, whispering in subdued tones, their conversation a choreography of secrecy. They knew the risk of exposure was high, but the alternative, total annihilation, was unacceptable. In the shadows of the forest rage, a quiet resistance had emerged. It was not dramatic, nor did it promise glory, but it was profoundly human. An attempt to temper madness with reason, to salvage hope from despair. By dawn, Hitler would issue new commands, unaware that the battlefield had already been shaped by those who understood the grim truth. The general's quiet revolt was not just a strategy. It was a moral stand, a testament to the capacity of individuals to exercise judgment and courage in the face of tyranny. History would remember their names, not always for defiance, but for the lives they saved amid the ruins of a collapsing front. The Eastern Front raged, but inside the bunker, the seeds of resistance had taken root, proving that even in the shadow of a dictator, reason could endure. Hitler's fury was no longer contained within his speeches. It radiated through every corner of the bunker, a suffocating presence that made even the most seasoned officers flinch. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, scanned maps that no longer reflected reality, searching desperately for a miracle that did not exist. He was a man grasping at shadows, demanding impossible victories, while the world around him crumbled. Every report from the front lines felt like a personal betrayal, each telegram a dagger pointing at his own illusions. By now, the generals had grown accustomed to this cycle of rage and delusion. They had learned to interpret the commands not as mandates, but as theatrical outbursts, a performance for which they alone had to bear the burden of practical execution. Hitler's latest directive was no exception, an audacious counteroffensive that would supposedly reverse months of setbacks on the Eastern Front. The plan was audacious in theory, reckless in practice, and utterly detached from the reality of depleted forces, overstretched supply lines, and the relentless advance of the Red Army. General von Run, a man whose reputation for strategic insight had once inspired confidence, now found himself navigating a psychological minefield. Each meeting with Hitler was a delicate dance. Nod, agree, and feign enthusiasm, all while knowing that any honest assessment could trigger wrath or dismissal. The Führer's desperation was palpable, manifesting in frantic gestures, fevered pacing, and a voice that oscillated between shrill commands and bitter lamentations. His generals listened, recording every word, translating it into plans that might just preserve what was left of the army, all while shielding him from the stark truth. In private, discussions took on a grimly practical tone. Officers huddled over maps, tracing the routes of doomed offensives, calculating troop movements, and anticipating the inevitable Soviet counterattacks. They were professionals in a theater of chaos, forced to reconcile the fantasy of Hitler's last-ditch strategies with the harsh arithmetic of military reality. Logistics, ammunition, morale, terrain, all had to be considered, yet every resource was stretched thin. The generals knew the front lines would bear the consequences of every irrational order, yet they also knew that measured compliance could mitigate the carnage. Hitler's obsession with miracles was no longer mere rhetoric. It had become a consuming mania. Each plan he presented was layered with grandiose promises of sudden victories, spectacular reversals, and the annihilation of the enemy. Yet, beneath the veneer of confidence, there was a man terrified of obsolescence, of the historical judgment that would be passed on his failures. He demanded loyalty, unwavering and immediate, without understanding that the men tasked with executing his vision were confronting reality in real time. The general's quiet rebellion continued, manifested not in defiance, but in pragmatism. Orders were interpreted in ways that maximized survival, resources were reallocated under the guise of obedience, and critical retreats were masked as tactical maneuvers. They were playing a dangerous game, appearing to submit while secretly safeguarding their troops. This delicate balance of illusion and action was the only form of resistance they could afford in the shadow of a desperate foe. By nightfall, the bunker hummed with tense energy. Hitler, exhausted but unyielding, retreated to his private quarters, leaving his officers to implement plans that would almost certainly fail. Outside, the Eastern Front continued its brutal advance, Soviet forces relentless, and cities under siege. Inside, the general's burden was psychological as much as strategic, navigating the demands of a man in denial while quietly preserving the remnants of an army on the brink of collapse. In this crucible of fear and calculation, the line between obedience and survival blurred. Hitler's last-ditch plans were not just impossible, they were dangerous fantasies. And yet, through the haze of desperation and madness, The general's pragmatism offered a fragile lifeline, a reminder that even in the shadow of tyranny, reason could endure, and some lives could still be saved. The bunker was a theater of quiet tension, where the unspoken resistance of the generals spoke louder than Hitler's relentless tirades. By this stage, the Führer's obsession with miracles had reached a fever pitch, and his generals had perfected the art of surviving his outbursts without compromising the army. Each nod, each affirmation of his reckless strategies, was a carefully measured act. A performance designed to protect not just their careers but the lives of the men under their command. In the shadows, a silent revolt was unfolding. General Model, known for his disciplined pragmatism and tactical foresight, moved through the maps with deliberate precision, while Hitler dictated movements that defied reason. Model recalculated troop deployments, anticipating where resistance could be mounted and losses minimized. He understood the futility of the Führer's commands, but recognized the necessity of translating madness into manageable action. Each decision was a balance between feigned obedience and quiet defiance, a tightrope walk over the abyss of impending disaster. The tension was compounded by the emotional strain of leadership. The generals bore the weight of not just strategy but human lives. Hitler's vision, disconnected from reality, demanded impossible feats, yet it was their duty to reconcile this fantasy with the harsh truths of the battlefield. Soldiers were already fatigued, supplies dwindling, morale fractured, and yet they would be sent on what were essentially suicidal operations if the generals did not intervene subtly. Their rebellion was silent, tactical, and invisible, executed through careful reinterpretation of orders and creative adjustments that would shield the troops from complete annihilation. Hitler's paranoia also played a role. He could not tolerate open dissent, and the generals had learned to cloak their skepticism beneath layers of loyalty and exaggerated enthusiasm. Each meeting was a delicate dance. Agree verbally, implement selectively, and never give him a reason to believe that reality had outstripped his control. In this environment, leadership became an exercise in psychological endurance as much as military acumen. Officers read between the lines, anticipating the Führer's moods, and acted as buffers between his fury and the soldiers. Communication became an art of subtext. Orders sent to the front lines were often couched in language that appeared to comply with Hitler's instructions while containing the necessary latitude for survival. Generals would subtly adjust attack timings, redirect units, and prioritize defensive maneuvers, all without triggering suspicion. This covert coordination required trust, precision, and a deep understanding of both Hitler's psyche and the harsh realities of the collapsing fronts. Each decision was a rebellion in miniature, a quiet assertion of reason within the chaos. Yet, even in their silent revolt, the generals were acutely aware of their limits. Hitler's mental state was deteriorating, his expectations increasingly detached from reality, and the margins for maneuver shrinking daily. Every miscalculation could trigger catastrophic consequences, yet to do nothing would mean certain death for the men they commanded. Their resistance was a paradox, a rebellion hidden within obedience, a fight for survival conducted under the watchful eyes of a tyrant oblivious to the subtleties of control. Outside the bunker, the war continued its brutal march. The Eastern Front was relentless, Scythia's Bunad, and the enemy advanced with inexorable determination. Inside, the general's silent revolt offered a fragile shield, preserving remnants of the army through calculated deception. Each act of subtle defiance was a testament to their skill, courage, and humanity. A quiet rebellion against the fantasies of a desperate Führer. In this crucible of madness, the line between loyalty and survival blurred. The general's revolt was not insurrection, it was strategy, morality, and duty converging in the shadow of despair. It was their most potent weapon, a lifeline for the men they served, and a reminder that even in the face of tyranny, reason could endure, silently shaping the course of events in ways Hitler could neither see nor comprehend. The air in the Führer's bunker was thick with the scent of despair and the faint metallic tension of tension. Outside, Berlin was crumbling under relentless Allied bombardment, a city once the symbol of Nazi grandeur reduced to rubble and smoke. Inside, Hitler sat hunched over maps, his once legendary confidence eroded into something brittle and frantic. The generals had grown adept at navigating his outbursts, tempering his unrealistic demands with quiet pragmatism. But even they could not disguise the looming truth. The war was lost, and no miracle could change that. For hours, Hitler raged at the impossibility of the situation. His vision of a resurgent Germany, of armies turning the tide in impossible feats of heroism, collided violently with the reality. His generals had been silently managing. Model Guderian and Kesselring exchanged knowing glances, each fully aware that the man before them was a prisoner of his own delusions. They had carried out desperate strategies, redirected units, and minimized casualties where possible. But the enemy pressed on with overwhelming force, leaving little room for manipulation. The conversation shifted from tactical concerns to a darker, more personal reckoning. Hitler, sensing the inevitability of defeat, began to articulate his fear, anger, and disbelief. His generals listened, trained in the art of silent resistance, allowing him to vent while subtly steering discussions toward practical realities. Each word, each command, was a test, a trap in which they had to navigate between survival and duty, between loyalty and the unspoken acknowledgement that Germany was nearing the abyss. Outside, the thunder of artillery punctuated the conversations, a grim reminder of the cost of delusion. Civilians huddled in basements, soldiers clung to their positions, and the city's infrastructure lay in ruins. Inside the bunker, Hitler's desperation manifested as increasingly erratic orders, ranging from implausible counterattacks to fantasies of defensive lines that no longer existed. The generals responded with measured compliance, transforming his commands into feasible actions wherever possible, masking retreat and consolidation as strategic offensives. Each move was a subtle act of defiance, a survival strategy disguised as obedience. As the night deepened, the psychological toll became evident. Hitler's once commanding presence flickered, revealing moments of vulnerability, despair, and bitter self. The generals bore witness to a man confronting the chasm between his grandiose vision and the unforgiving reality of defeat. Yet even in these moments, they maintained their resolve, balancing empathy with the unyielding responsibility of leadership. Every decision, every reassessment, was a thread in the delicate fabric holding the remnants of the German military together.